Fellas, we're starting 2025 off with a bang. UFC Saudi Arabia, very stacked fight night, which isn't a shocker to be fair because they always stack the Saudi Arabia cards. We're going to be breaking down every fighter competing on this stacked card as well as my own personal predictions for the Adesanya versus Imavov card. And we'll start off with the first fight, which is going to be Hamdy Abdelwahab versus Jamal Pogues. Now, even though he's only 3-0, he's Abdelwahab. Don't let it fool you. This guy's got a huge background in Greco-Roman wrestling. He's actually been in the Olympic team for Greco-Roman wrestling. He's also competed in bare knuckle MMA on Masvidal's promotion with 2 very quick finishes on there. After that, went 3-0 in MMA with 3 finishes. Debuted in the UFC against Don'Tale Mayes, where he originally beat Don'Tale Mayes, but unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but it got overturned by to a no contest because he ended up taking steroids. So he's been out for quite some time. Going to be taking on Jamal Pogues, who had a bit of an up and down career outside the UFC. Won in the Contender Series, but didn't get a UFC contract. Then he got another opportunity at the Contender Series. Ended up winning, and so far he's 2-1 in the UFC with his only loss being to Mick Parkin. Even though Jamal Pogues has shown that he's much better at the higher level, he's a very nice striker. Well, I say nice striker, he's a very high volume striker. I'm going to go with Abdelwahab to win this one. I'm expecting him to be much better now that he's had a couple of years off to really train and stay away from the sport. And I just love it. I like his Greco-Roman wrestling. I think that Greco-Roman wrestling in a division as Shawwell's the heavyweight division is going to be massively beneficial. And we've seen Jamal Pogues deal with grappling problems before when he faced Thomas Peterson, and in my opinion, an Olympic grappler like Abdelwahab, I think he's going to take down Jamal Pogues, and we know that Jamal Pogues has struggled getting back up from his back, as we saw in that Thomas Peterson fight. So I'm going to go with Abdelwahab to win this one by decision. I don't think it's going to be pure domination. I don't think he gets a finish against Jamal Pogues, and if they do stand on the feet, even though I would say Abdelwahab is the more dangerous striker, I think Pogues would win on the feet, but I just think that Abdelwahab will eventually take down Jamal Pogues, keep him down for the majority of the round, and win on points because of that. The next fight, we have Bogdan Grad versus Lucas Alexander. Bogdan Grad had a really nice run outside the UFC with a lot of finishes, gets a chance on the Contender Series, ends up getting knocked out by Tom Nolan brutally, goes 2-0 with 2 finishes in a different promotion after that, then gets another opportunity at the Contender Series and recently looked really good and won in the Contender Series. He's been given a UFC contract against Lucas Alexander, who had nothing notable going on outside the UFC. He loses his UFC debut to Joanderson Brito, goes 1-1 in his next 2 fights, and he is coming off a finish loss where he missed weight as well. So this seems like a fight where the loser of this fight is probably not going to get a UFC contract. Bogdan Grad, who's already lost on the Contender Series and he's 1-1 in the Contender Series, if he loses to Alexander, probably not going to get a contract, and Alexander will probably get cut. But I'm going to pick Bogdan Grad to win this one by decision. I'm a fan of Bogdan Grad. He's got this kind of chaotic style. He likes mixing it up with the wrestling. I think he's just overall better everywhere the fight goes than Lucas Alexander. I also think he's very dangerous, even though he might have not shown that on the Contender Series. He's like a dangerous fighter, but he controls the danger. He doesn't go out there with an all guns blazing style, even though he is kind of like chaotic. So I'm going to pick Bogdan Grad to win this one by decision, but there's not much information considering it's a Contender Series guy versus a 1-2 guy, but I'm going to go Bogdan Grad. Jasmine Jasudavicious versus Mayra Bueno Silva. Actually quite a good women MMA fight to put on UFC Saudi Arabia. Jasmine Jasudavicious had a good run outside the UFC with her only loss being to Elise Reed, who's now on a bit of a run in herself in the UFC. Wins on the Contender Series in good fashion, and since then, she's only had 2 losses to Tracy Cortez and Natalia Silva. Now, even though that Tracy Cortez loss isn't a good look because Cortez is not by no means a top fighter, she's one of the best women MMA grapplers in my opinion. She's taken on Mayra Bueno Silva, who had a decent run before the UFC, gets a win on the Contender Series. She's had a bunch of submissions in the UFC. She's a very heavy submission grappler. She's beaten the likes of Jillian Robertson as well, but she's also had a lot of downs. She fought Pennington for the belt, ended up losing in a very boring fight. She fought Mayra Yasin last year, ended up losing because of a doctor stoppage. She faced Holly Holm, where she submitted Holly Holm, but it got taken over because apparently, well, not apparently, but she got positive drug tests in the system, and she's also lost a couple of times in the UFC. She's had a bit of an up and down UFC career as Mayra Bueno Silva, and her past couple of fights haven't really been going anywhere, and she's now moving down to the flyweight division to face Jasmine Jasudavicious. Even though Mayra Bueno Silva's been around that title picture in the bantamweight division, I'm going to pick Jasudavicious to win this one by decision. I think this is a very favourable matchup for Jasudavicious, and on top of that, like I said before, she's one of the best women MMA grapplers in my opinion. I think she's going to take her down with this kind of high pressure, high pace grappling style that she has. And I can just see her wearing out Mayra Bueno Silva. Now obviously Mayra Bueno Silva's got a big jiu-jitsu threat, but she's coming down from the bantamweight division. We don't know how she looks at flyweight. She could look worse. And even though Mayra Bueno Silva has a submission chance, I think on the feet, Jasmine Jasudavicious is the more busy striker. I think when it comes to grappling, Jasmine is definitely the better wrestler. I think the only really area in the fight where I'd give Silva an edge is with the jiu-jitsu and the the submission threat, which I think Jasudavicious, who's never been finished in her entire MMA career, will probably be able to overcome. And on top of that, like I said, Silva hasn't got a legitimate win since Landsberg. I know she beat Holly Holm, who's like 46 years old now, but even that was a no contest. So I'm going to go Jasudavicious to win this one by decision. She's a good prospect in women MMA. I know she lost to Tracy Cortez, which isn't a good look, but she's a very good wrestler. She's coming off a good finish, and if she can beat Mayra Bueno Silva, who's a title challenger in the bantamweight division, she's probably going to be getting a title shot soon in the flyweight division. Then we've got Ziam versus Mike Davis. I think this is actually higher up on the card, but I've just forgot to update it. But either way, Ziam versus Mike Davis. Ziam, again, nothing notable to talk about outside the UFC apart from the fact that coming into the UFC, he was a finishing machine. He was getting a lot of finishes outside the UFC, not against any notable names, but he was having a lot of finishes, and he kind of turned into a bit of a decision machine since joining the UFC. He had, previous to the Matt Frevola fight, every single one of his fights, apart from when he lost, ended up going to a decision. He was kind of a bit of a boring fighter where he'd hold people against the cage, he'd hold people in clinches, he'd be a bit of a risk-free striker, until he fought Matt Frevola in his most recent fight and absolutely brutalized him the entire fight, was dominating the fight, and then ends it up by getting a knockout of the year contender, where he absolutely sends Matt Frevola into a different dimension where he knees him straight in the jaw. He's going to be taking on Mike Davis. Mike Davis, good run outside the UFC, actually had a couple of boxing matches as well to mix things up. Came on the contender series against Sadiq Youssef, ended up losing that fight, but again, it's Sadiq Youssef. He was ranked at one point, there's no shame. Wins 2 fights outside the UFC, loses his next fight in the UFC against Gilbert Burns, but since then he's been 4-0 with 2 finishes against some pretty decent names. I'm going to go with Ziam to win this one by decision. This is a close fight to pick because even though Ziam, in my opinion, especially after that performance against Frevola, is one of the best unranked 155ers, Mike Davis has looked good on this winning streak too, but again, I'm going to go with Ziam simply from how he looked in that Matt Frevola fight. He looked really good against Frevola. He seemed like he was willing to take risks, and it worked in his favour. He was out wrestling Matt Frevola at times. He was out striking him for the majority of the fight, and to end it off in that brutal finish in the way that he did was massively impressive for Ziam. Rose his stock massively. Mike Davis, even though he's been on this impressive winning streak and he hits quite hard for a lightweight, there's nothing overly impressive that I'm seeing from Mike Davis, and I can see Ziam taking him to a decision. I can see him holding him in the clinch and beating him on the feet. Maybe the wrestling is where I'd give the edge to Mike Davis, but we've seen Ziam against wrestlers before, and he hasn't done too bad, although he did get taken down like 7 times against Claudio Puelles. If you are a betting man, I wouldn't recommend betting on this fight, but I'm going to go with Ziam to win this one by decision. I actually think, with all due respect to Mike Davis, I was expecting a bit of a bigger step up in competition for Ziam, maybe like a Javelin Turner or somebody in the rankings. So Mike Davis is definitely a tough fight. It is a close fight, but I'm going to go with Ziam to win by decision and then hopefully get somebody in the rankings. Then we've got Terrance Mckinney versus Damir Hadzovic. Terrance Mckinney is the definition of a kill or be killed fighter. If you're watching Terrance Mckinney, it probably won't get past the first round. Every single one of his fights, whether it be a win or whether it be a loss, has not gone to a decision. They've all been finishes. In fact, he's got the top 3 shortest average fight time in the UFC right now, with 2 minutes and 38 seconds being an average, and that's not even counting outside of the UFC where he had some massively close fights as well. If you look at his run up to the UFC, it's the same thing. His fights are ending in 7 seconds, 43 seconds, just over a minute. He's having this massive run outside the UFC with a bunch of stoppages. Fights in the contender series against Sean Woodson, gets kneed in the jaw and knocked out by Sean Woodson. After that, went 3-1 outside the UFC with, again, nothing but stoppages. Debuts against Matt Frevola, gets a brutally quick finish against Matt Frevola where he knocks him out, 7 seconds. And then since then, he's had a bit of an up and down UFC career where he's been winning some, he's been losing some, but either way, whether he's won or he's lost, it's been an extremely fast finish, which has ended in the result. And in his last fight, he got brutally knocked out by Esteban Ribovics in quite a comedic knockout. And he's going to be taking on Damir Hadzovic. Hadzovic, again, nothing really notable to talk about outside the UFC, and even inside the UFC, he hasn't had the best career. He's lost the majority of his fights, and his last fight was against Mark Jacquese. Mark Jacquese hasn't been in the UFC for like a year, and his last fight was in July of 2022, which I think that was the Aspinall Tibura card as well, which just puts into perspective, no, the Aspinall versus Blades card, even further than that. That's what, over 2 years ago now, coming up to 3. So I think they've done this fight to kind of push Terrance Mckinney, give him a bit of a 3 win, but knowing Terrance Mckinney, it wouldn't surprise me if he finds himself in the situation where he gets finished. But I'm going to go with Terrance McKinney by submission. Terrance McKinney has quite an underrated grappling game that I think he could use against Hadzovic, who's not the best grappler. We saw him get submitted by Kaan. I think it was just over a minute when he got submitted, if not less. But Terrance McKinney has this big wrestling background. He's actually got a pretty decent submission game. I might even go out there and say that if you take away danger, he's probably a better grappler than he is a striker. But I could also see Terrance McKinney running in there guns blazing like he does in every single one of his fights and either chinning Hadzovic or getting chinned himself. But I think if Terrance McKinney uses his fight IQ, he's coming off a brutal knockout loss, and he's lost 3 of his last 5. I think if he really wants to get this win, taking the fight to the mat, faking the striking, taking the fight to the mat, and wrapping up a submission against Damir Hadzovic, who's been out for 3 years, will probably be the best game plan for Terrance McKinney. He's definitely the more superior grappler. He could definitely win this fight on the feet. I think this fight is tailor-made to give Terrance McKinney another win, but I'm going to go with Terrance McKinney to win this one by submission in the first round. I mean, if you're going to pick a Terrance McKinney fight, it's got to be in the first or the second round. You can't pick him to win by decision. Hadzovic, the only reason I see Hadzovic winning this fight is, like I said before, Terrance McKinney runs in all guns blazing and gets caught by a big shot, but I don't think that's going to happen. Terrance McKinney back in the winner column, submission in the first round. Then we have Shamil, Gaziev and Thomas Peterson, the ranked heavyweight versus one of the best unranked heavyweights, which just says everything about this division. You've got Shamil Gaziev, who aside from being the uncrowned heavyweight champion of the world, was on an absolute tear outside the UFC. A bunch of fast stoppages. His first 4 fights all ended in less than a minute. And he was massively in shape. I don't know if he took steroids, but if you look at it before the UFC, he actually had a sick physique. Wins on the Contender Series by finish. Then he debuts against Martin Badai, which is actually a win that has aged really well. Smashed Martin Badai to pieces. Gets a Fight Night main event opportunity against Rozenstruik. Gets outboxed. His cardio runs out. Decides that he wants no more of it. And then in his most recent fight, basically just lies down on Don'Tale Mayes and smothers him to death and gets a decision win. He's going to be taking on Thomas Peterson, who was another one of these fighters in the heavyweight division that just has pure finishes outside the UFC, with his only loss being to Waldo Cortez Acosta outside the UFC, which is a loss that has kind of aged quite well. Wins on the Contender Series via submission, and so far is 1-1 in the UFC, losing to Jamal Pogues, but beating Mohamed Usman in his most recent fight, which, if anything, just says everything about Mohamed Usman. But either way, Shamil Gaziev versus Thomas Peterson, I've got to go Shamil Gaziev by TKO in the second round. I think Gaziev, all memes aside, all jokes aside, he's actually quite a dangerous heavyweight, because he's got when Shamil Gaziev takes you down, there's not much you can do. The guy's huge. Most heavyweights, especially when they're unathletic, I can't see them being able to get back up from Shamil Gaziev. Now, Thomas Peterson is a good grappler, but I can just see Gaziev walking forward with that heavy kind of stand-up style, because he is heavy-handed as Shamil Gaziev. He's actually quite powerful on the feet. I can see him pressuring Thomas Peterson, taking him to the mat, using the control time and basically just his weight to keep him down. And in that second round, I won't predict him to finish in the third because of his stamina, but I could see him just smashing him with ground and pound against Thomas Peterson. Just beating him with his ground game. He seems to be a bit more disciplined in training camp, but now he's training with actual heavyweights. So Shamil Gaziev versus Thomas Peterson. Thomas Peterson's only chance is if he pulls off a submission or can somehow keep the fight on the feet, but Gaziev just dominated Don'Tale Mayes, destroyed Martin Badai, and his only loss is to Rank the Rozenstruik, who's an underrated kickboxer. So I'm going to say that Shamil Gaziev takes down Thomas Peterson and beats him via ground and pound. If not, he's going to win a decision. I really don't see a key to victory for Thomas Peterson in this fight. Shamil Gaziev, a bit of a step down, well, maybe not a step down actually, but you know, he's ranked now in the heavyweight division. I think he gets past Thomas Peterson, and like I said before, memes aside, he's actually quite a good heavyweight prospect to look out for. Then we've got Mohamed Naimov taking on Kaan Ofli. Mohamed Naimov, it was on a good run outside the UFC, loses on the Contender Series, then immediately loses in his next fight, which means he has to get another 3-fight winning streak before he gets another chance in the UFC. Debuts against Jamie Mullarkey, knocks him out. Then he gets a bit of a controversial win over Nathaniel Wood, where there was a lot of dodgy decisions from the referee in that fight. And then in his most recent fight, he got a win. Well, not in his most recent fight, but in his most recent win, he got a win, but it was via leg injury. And in his most recent fight, he took on Felipe Lima on short notice and got submitted by Felipe Lima. He's going to be taking on Kaan Ofli, who had a bit of a terrible start to his MMA career, but eventually pulled it off with this massive winning streak. Gets an opportunity to fight on the Ultimate Fighter 2024. Won 2 fights on the Ultimate Fighter, but couldn't win the finale because he got knocked out cold in the finale of the Ultimate Fighter, which is his most recent fight. I think this is kind of a fight to maybe push Mohamed Naimov in front of the Abu Dhabi crowd. I'm going to go Mohamed Naimov to knock him out in the first. I think Naimov knocks him out. We know that Kaan Ofli, he hasn't won in the UFC. His best promotion that he's won in is the Ultimate Fighter. And if we know anything about the Ultimate Fighter, it means absolutely nothing. It's not like the Contender Series. It means nothing when it comes to talent. Naimov hits very hard. I think he can definitely knock him out on the feet. And I also think he's got the ability to mix it up with the grappling and take him down if he wants. I just see all the keys to victory in this fight being for Mohamed Naimov. If he wants to take it to the mat, he's going to do that. If he wants to knock him out on the feet, I can see him doing that. Although Ofli's quite a busy striker, I don't really see him beating Naimov. Bit of a step down for Naimov. So I'm going to go with Mohamed Naimov to beat Kaan Ofli. And if anything, Mohamed Naimov was beating Felipe Lima in that first round. So Mohamed Naimov to knock him out in the first round. Then we've got Said Nurmagomedov versus Vinicius Oliveira. Really good fight between two bantamweight prospects. Yeah, this is a banger of a fight. You've got Said Nurmagomedov, who, despite what a lot of people think, is not related to Khabib. Yes, he's from Dagestan. Yes, he has the last name Nurmagomedov, but he's not related to Khabib or Umar, and he's actually not even a wrestler. Had a good run outside the UFC, nothing really notable to talk about. Debuts, gets a 2-fight winning streak in the UFC, loses to Raoni Barcelos, and it seems like Barcelos seems to be the big prospect killer of the bantamweight division, so he loses to Barcelos, then goes on a 4-fight winning streak with 3 finishes, then loses to Jonathan Martinez, but that was a very close, controversial fight. In fact, most people, including myself, would say that Jonathan Martinez should have won that fight. And since then, he's submitted Muin Gafurov, which is, again, is a win that has aged quite well after we saw Gafurov at UFC 311. Going to be taking on Vinicius Oliveira, who had a massive MMA career outside the UFC. Where I think he got like 19 wins and 3 losses. Debuts on the Contender Series, gets a brutal knockout. Then he gets one of the best knockouts of 2024 against Bernardo Sapai in his most recent, well, he's in his second to most recent fight in 2024. And then in his most recent fight, he completely just styled on Ricky Simon, which is a really good win because Ricky Simon used to be ranked. This is a tough fight for both of them. I think this genuinely just comes down to who the better striker is going to be. Vinicius Oliveira is a very, very crafty striker, very, very high-level striker. And Said Nurmagomedov, I wouldn't say he's as good on the feet, but he's a very kind of crafty striker, similar to Zabit Magomed Sharipov. And he's also got the jiu-jitsu threat, which I think if Said Nurmagomedov can kind of work on his wrestling and he can get the fight to the mat, he would have an advantage. But it's a close stand-up fight. Again, not one of these fights that I would recommend betting on, but I'm going to go with Said Nurmagomedov by decision. Again, like I said before, not a fight worth betting on. I can just see Nurmagomedov doing the better on the feet. He's faced better competition. He should have beaten Jonathan Martinez, in my opinion, who is a very good bantamweight striker. And as good as Vinicius Oliveira is, and I have nothing bad to say about him, I just think we've seen a lot more from Said Nurmagomedov. So I'm going to pick him to win by decision. He's also got a bigger jiu-jitsu threat, and if anyone's going to win in the grappling exchanges, it's going to be Said Nurmagomedov. And maybe if he gets him in the clinch, he can find that signature guillotine choke, which he seems to get a lot of the time as well. So I'm going to go with Said Nurmagomedov to win this one by decision against Vinicius Oliveira, but it should be a fun stand-up fight if it does take place on the feet. But I just think Nurmagomedov has shown me enough. I'm going Nurmagomedov decision. Then we have a fight between two heavy-handed heavyweights. This is going to be a banger. Sergei Pavlovich versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Sergei Pavlovich, I mean, I don't need to explain this guy to you. One of the most dangerous guys in the UFC. 83% of his wins by way of knockout. Coming into the UFC, he was on a complete tear of just quick knockouts in the first round. He only had 3 decisions. The rest were first-round knockouts. Loses to Alistair Overeem in his UFC debut, but since then went on a 6-fight winning streak, all by first-round knockout, with some good names on there as well. Derek Lewis, Tatu Ivaza, Curtis Blades. Finished them all in the first round and was probably the biggest heavyweight prospect we've had in ages. Then he gets the interim title fight with Tom Aspinall, gets knocked out in the first round with Tom Aspinall, but as we know, Aspinall's one of the best. And then he gets dog-walked by Alexander Volkov in his most recent fight. He's going to be taking on Rozenstruik, who is a former kickboxing champion and like multiple, not like an elite kickboxing champion, but has a big kickboxing background where he competed in kickboxing. Had a good start to his MMA career. Comes over to the UFC, gets a 4-fight winning streak all by way of finish. And he's kind of been a bit of a win-loss fighter in the heavyweight division since that 4-fight winning streak. He's only really lost to the best as well. I mean, he's lost to Francis Ngannou, Cyril Gane, Jelton Almeida, Alexander Volkov, and Curtis Blades. All of these guys are top 5 heavyweights in the world. If you take away these guys, he's not lost to anyone else. In fact, he's coming off a 2-fight winning streak over Shamil Gaziev last year and Tatu Ivaza, where he kind of got robbed even though he won the fight. He shouldn't have been a split decision. It should have been a clear unanimous. So he's on a 2-fight winning streak. I'm going to say this. Don't count out Rozenstruik. Like, Rozenstruik is solid. I would say from a technique perspective, he's probably a better kickboxer than Pavlovich. He's a very sound kickboxer from a technique perspective, but I've just got to go with Sergei Pavlovich. The guy is probably one of the most dangerous heavyweights on the roster right now. His reach, his accuracy, and his power with his hands. His boxing is more crisp than ever. I'm expecting the best version of Sergei Pavlovich. I'm going to pick him to win by first-round knockout, but I'm not saying this with super high confidence. I can see Jairzinho Rozenstruik being this short kind of, you know, one of these kind of brawly blobs in the heavyweight division, which is kind of like a tailor-made guy for Sergei Pavlovich to beat. If you look at everyone Sergei Pavlovich beats, it tends to be these smaller, shorter heavyweights who like to brawl. And that kind of describes Rozenstruik. Aspinall, very light on his feet. Volkov, 6'7", rangy kickboxer. Rozenstruik, good kickboxer, but he kind of fits into the category of a Pavlovich victim. I think Pavlovich is going to get back in the winning column and get another first-round knockout over Rozenstruik in this fight. But again, you can't necessarily count out Rozenstruik. If we saw what Volkov did to Pavlovich, maybe I can see Rozenstruik outpointing Pavlovich, but I'm going to pick him to win by first-round KO and get back in the winning column and finally get back to the big dogs of the heavyweight division. Then we've got the co-main event, MVP versus Shara Nurmagomedov. I was talking about this fight months ago before it was even a thing, and it was one of my dream fights in the UFC, and this is one of the best fights they could have made. Two of some of the most crafty strikers. MVP moving up to the middleweight division. This is a banger. Now, MVP, again, I don't need to describe this guy. He's kind of known for being that kind of showboaty, exciting striker outside of the UFC. And he's kind of done everything. He's competed in boxing. He's competed in grappling against Carlos Condit. He's competed in BKFC against Mike Perry. And he debuted against Kevin Holland, styled on Kevin Holland in that fight, completely pieced him up. Then he faces Ian Gary and gets completely out-grappled by Ian Gary. He's going to be taking on Shara Nurmagomedov, the one-eyed beast. Shara Nurmagomedov had this big run outside the UFC where he was just picking people apart and finishing people with his stand-up. He was this big prospect. And so far, he's 4-0 in the UFC. And he's coming off what I would say is a top 3 best knockouts of 2024, where he double spinning back fist KO'd Armen Petrosyan in a knockout of the year contender. This is going to be a standing masterclass. I don't see this fight going to the mat. If anybody's going to initiate the grappling, it's going to be MVP. He's been grappling a lot recently. Like I said, he grappled with Carlos Condit, and he's been talking about grappling. But I think this is going to be a stand-up fight where MVP wins. Again, it's not a fight that I'm picking with confidence, but I think MVP, he's displayed better striking at a better level. Even outside of the UFC and promotions like Bellator, he's a really good striker. He's shown it against, like, you know, really good opponents like Douglas Lima. Even inside the UFC, completely styling on Kevin Holland. I don't know if Shara Nurmagomedov would do the same thing. And as good as Magomedov is, even if you go back to the fight with Armen Petrosyan, he got that brutal knockout over Petrosyan. But in that first round, Petrosyan was landing a lot on Shara Nurmagomedov. Also, Magomedov struggled to get past Tricoli on the feet. Tricoli was genuinely a punching bag, and it took him, what, 2 or 3 rounds to finish him. He couldn't finish Mikal. He couldn't finish Bruno Silva. And I'm not talking as if MVP's this big finishing machine either, but I just think from a striking perspective, MVP's a better striker than Shara Nurmagomedov. He's a really weird fighter for Shara Nurmagomedov as well. They're both really crafty strikers. It's tough because they've both never seen anyone like each other, but I'm picking MVP. I think he's the better striker. To be completely honest, I don't think Shara should be ranked. Beating Armen Petrosyan shouldn't give you a top 15 ranking spot in the middleweight division. Solid stand-up fight, but I'm going to go with MVP to win by decision. Then we've got the main event, Adesanya versus Imavov. Seeing Adesanya on a Fight Night main event is weird. I've been used to Adesanya being a pay-per-view main event guy for like years now, so seeing him on a Fight Night is just crazy. And he's going to be taking on Nassim Imavov. Adesanya, obviously former middleweight champion, and I would say he's the second greatest middleweight of all time. I feel like Adesanya's resume, even though he fought at a very dull era in the middleweight division, he's got a solid resume. 2 wins against Robert Whittaker, Jared Cannonier, 2 wins against Marvin Vittori, Alex Pereira in the middleweight division, Anderson Silva, yes, it was a washed Anderson Silva, but still, Paulo Costa, Derek Brunson, Yoel Romero, Kelvin Gastelum. He was by far the best middleweight in his era. You know, I know he got finished by Porton and then obviously lost that fight where he got dog walked by Strickland and then he got submitted by Dricus du Plessis. So he's not in the best career position. He's going to be taking on Nassim Imavov, who, again, nothing notable outside of the UFC. Comes into the UFC, wins his, goes 4-1 in his first 5 fights, where he obviously lost to Phil Hawes. Gets a Fight Night main event against Sean Strickland, loses to Sean Strickland by unanimous decision, then gets a no contest against Chris Curtis, and since that he's been on a 3-fight winning streak against some pretty good names. When he beat Roman Dolidze, I'm pretty sure Dolidze was coming off a winner. He might have come off that loss to Vittori, but Dolidze would say was still a top contender. He beat Cannonier when Cannonier was on a winning streak. He beat Brendan Allen when Brendan Allen was on a complete tear as well. So Imavov seems to be performing well, but the problem is he's not beating a single top middleweight. He hasn't beaten a Strickland. He's lost to Strickland. He hasn't beaten a Dricus. He hasn't beaten a Whittaker. He's beaten nobody. Whereas we've had Adesanya, we've seen him perform against the highest middleweights forever. I'm going to go with Israel Adesanya to win this one, and it's nothing against Imavov. It's just from we have seen a lot more from Israel Adesanya. I mean, he was winning that Dricus du Plessis fight on the feet until obviously he got finished, and he's one of the most notorious strikers in the UFC. Yes, he's a bit of a boring, risk-free striker, but he's a very effective striker at that. And I think he's going to pick apart Nassim Imavov for 5 rounds straight. Imavov's a good striker, very good striker, good pace that he sets on people, good takedown defense, and his wrestling is probably better than Adesanya's, even though I don't don't think he takes it to the mat. Like I said, good, busy striker, but I just think Izzy's a better striker than him. He's displayed it at the highest level, and this is a huge step down. Maybe not a huge step down, but it's definitely a big step down in competition from what Izzy's used to. He's used to facing title challengers like Alex Pereira, like Sean Strickland, like Dricus Duplessis, and Nasty Imavov. I mean, he's got some good wins. He's on a good winning streak, but 15-4 Imavov versus Adesanya, the second greatest middleweight of all time. Unless Adesanya's completely fallen off and he's completely washed, he should win this fight comfortably. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if he gets a finish, but I think the safe bet is to go with Israel Adesanya to pick apart Nasty Imavov across 5 rounds and get a decision win. But those are my predictions for UFC Saudi Arabia. Like I said, really stacked fight night. Can't wait for this card. Let me know your thoughts about this fight night card, and thank you for watching.